Greetings and welcome to the latest event in the Business Matters webinar series from Gies College of Business. I'm Amanda Brantner, Senior Associate Director here at the University of Illinois Gies College of Business, and I look forward to spending the next hour with you. Our faculty experts have developed this series of webinars to address some of the pressing issues businesses and leaders face today, from the economic impact of COVID-19 to cybersecurity and ethics. These webinars enable you to be better prepared to succeed and thrive through any number of challenges. Before we get started with creating a workplace climate that welcomes diverse perspectives with Associate Dean Brooke Elliott and Professor Alana Redstone, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items related to the Q&A portion of today's session. Please submit all of your questions via the Zoom Q&A feature. Your questions will be submitted publicly for the whole audience to see. In order to develop consensus around these questions, please use upvoting. The upvote them can be found next to the question in the Q&A window. Any general housekeeping questions will be answered in text by the Gies team working in the background. Questions submitted via chat will not be taken. Our moderator for today's webinar is Brooke Elliott, Associate Dean and EY Professor at Gies College of Business. Brooke oversees the strategy for our college's online programs, and she'll be leading the discussion with our presenter, Alana Redstone. Professor Redstone is a preeminent expert on diversity and sociology. She teaches courses in social statistics and political polarization. Her research focuses on viewpoint diversity, demography, immigration, and education. And much of her current work centers around campus climate and discourse. She's a contributing writer at Forbes.com, the creator of the video series Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes, and the co-author of Unsaleable Ideas: How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education. Please join me in welcoming Associate Dean Brooke Elliott and Professor Alana Redstone.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Alana, for joining us today, and thank you to all participants for joining us today for this engaging discussion. I'll just kick things off. Alana, could you tell us just a little bit about your background and experience, and just from your perspective, why it is important to engage in conversation where diverse opinions and perspectives are represented?
Sure. Yeah, so my background, so I am on the faculty in the sociology department here at the U of I, and the research, as Amanda mentioned, the work that I did in the earlier part of my career was on US immigration in a very academic sense. So I didn't really have a public facing side of my work, and that was sort of I have a joint degree in demography and sociology, and that was the work that I did for up until probably about 4 or 5 years ago, when I started to, for a number of reasons, to work more in this space of discourse and sort of communication across ideological divides, viewpoint diversity. These terms have a lot of overlap. And so the co-authored book that Amanda referred to is Unassailable Ideas. So that came out last fall through Oxford, and that looks at discourse, the role of sort of unwritten rules in social media in higher education specifically, although certainly everything we say in that book applies more broadly. I also teach a course here called Bigots and Snowflakes, which is I'm teaching now for the third time, which is fun and interesting. And then more specifically and relevant for this audience, I started Diverse Perspectives Consulting in the summer of 2019, if I'm remembering correctly. Everything pre-COVID is a little bit of a blur, and so that was really to take some of the work that I was doing inside of academia and bring it outside of academia, because the need was clear, and if anything, it's only grown. So I'll stop there, but I can obviously say more about it. So go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Alana. Yeah, and I think your expertise definitely is relevant to the audience that we have here today. Many business professionals and those who are either in the business profession or thinking of entering the business profession, we found ourselves often in a position where we have to have hard conversations, right? And there are a diverse set of opinions, and sometimes there are conflicting opinions. And I know that at least in our organization, we talk about the importance of inclusivity and hearing all opinions, and that it can really be a way to, even drive better decisions. But I know one thing that we've discussed is there are a lot of reasons why you might do this. So can you kind of go through and maybe talk about like what are the different motivations for building an environment and learning to manage an environment where there are a set of diverse perspectives and opinions, and why that might be important for a business leader?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think so. I'm going to just back up one second to something that you said earlier. So, which is, the idea. So, inclusivity, which has been, for all the attention that it's received, we collectively sort of continue to fall short in this space. And part of that is that a lot of the programming that is done in this area it often starts from the assumption that there's one particular way to understand the world, which is usually that which is endorsed by the facilitator, and that it simply doesn't reflect people's the ideological variation along about how we think about things like identity and fairness and intent and all of these things. So by bringing in sort of ideological diversity into how we think about diversity more generally, it's not just that you're adding sort of one item to a long list and sort of, here's our list of 17 things that we care about and here's number 18. It really is a reshuffling of the deck that kind of happens. And so then to your other question about why this work matters, I mean, there are different ways to be motivated in this space, and I'm going to list three, and hopefully one of them will land with, if maybe they don't all land with your audience, one of them, somebody will at least find something in there. So one is that you don't want, from a business standpoint, there's nothing good that comes from a climate where people feel like they have to walk on eggshells. And so figuring out how to navigate the space between, right? So on the one hand, nobody wants a workplace climate where people are just sort of running roughshod over each other's feelings and right. So that's not helpful. Nor is having a space, again, where people feel like they have to walk on eggshells or feel like there are invisible tripwires everywhere. That's not helpful either. It's not helpful from, a turnover or productivity and employee satisfaction standpoint. It's not good. And it's certainly not good for the sort of broader goal of inclusivity that, that a lot of companies and a lot of organizations are oriented towards. So that's one reason. The second reason I would say is that, excuse me, this political, whether you want to call it political diversity, ideological diversity, I tend to steer away a little bit from the term political, because when I say political diversity, people tend to think about kind of water cooler arguments about who you voted for in the last election. I'm not even this one, but any election, or questions that appear on a ballot. And that's when I'm talking about is really sort of a much broader view of how we think about controversial topics, controversial and sensitive topics. That's what I mean by political. So, but the second reason is that, this diversity of thought, it is in your organization anyway. It's there anyway, right? So and I mean, I know you have an international audience, but in this country, if you want to go to the most recent election, I mean, regardless of where you stand on that, there are 74 million people who voted for Trump and 81 million people who voted for Biden. And if you think that you don't have some mix of this in your workplace, it's not likely, even in places, as politically skewed as Silicon Valley, the county that Silicon Valley is, I'm trying to remember the name of the county, but I'm totally blanking on it right now. It was still like 25% in favor of Trump. So, I mean, again, this is there anyway. And so recognizing this is going to get you closer to this broader view of inclusivity that people are leading toward. The third is sort of the most lofty, and it may appeal to some, it certainly appeals to me, which is that there is a certain moral imperative here, I think, which has to do with democracy and democratic norms, and how we think about, again, sort of this term of viewpoint diversity, and essentially that, I mean, not to overstate the argument, but you can't have democracy without it. So that's sort of the moral imperative about it, and that's less of a bottom line argument. But I think there are plenty of, as I've just outlined, I think there are plenty of bottom line arguments for it as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. Those are, I think, three very, unique views. And my guess is each one of them probably resonates with one or more of our audience members. Right. I know for me, like, I do think about it as a moral imperative. As a leader, I do believe that it can actually bring value, that if you can build an environment where diverse opinions are shared and shared freely, so not shared with reticence or with some fear, right, that there will be a strong pushback or some type of retaliatory behavior. And by building that type of inclusive environment, your organization can drive better decisions. And I love your point about, the diverse opinions are there. They may not, maybe you don't have an environment where it's comfortable to express them, but you shouldn't take that, you shouldn't make the presumption that that means that the diverse opinions don't exist, because
Right.
I mean, they do. And we're both in academia, and we probably self-select into academia because we enjoy being in an environment with diverse opinions, but they exist all over.
Right.
And so it's just trying to create an environment where individuals feel comfortable bringing those to bear.
Right.
And
I don't mean to suggest that it's easy. I mean, there's a reason, hard things are just hard. And so there's a reason, we can talk more about that, but this stuff is hard and it's sensitive and it's controversial and it's, but I guess where I've landed on this is that there's a better way to do it, rather that's not sort of pretending, like sort of shoving this all in the closet somewhere and shutting the door and hoping it doesn't burst.
Yeah, positively. I know at least, over the last year, probably the last 12 months, we've been having a different set of conversations within the college around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's forced us to have some really, really hard conversations, and conversations with our colleagues that we probably never would have had before. And I think we've kind of fumbled through, like, how do we do it? We know it's important, but to your point, it's not easy, even when you're with friends and colleagues that you've known for years, right? Let alone whenever maybe you're in what you deem as a less safe environment. So.
Right. No, I think that's true.
Just the kind of next thing I would like you to talk about, I mean, whenever we bring business professionals together, we always try to equip them up, how, so if you are a business leader, how might you think about going back to your organization this afternoon or tomorrow, and having these types of conversation? Are there certain, tips or tools? Is there a certain mindset that you should take? Are there certain things that you should not do if you want to build this type of behavior? So could you just share kind of your expertise there and your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in my own work, where this has sort of come out is there's two sort of models, and there's actually three, but there are two that are relevant for this context. One is, I come in and facilitate a discussion, like I come in and lead workshops and seminars and things like that. The other is this is along more closer to what you were suggesting, which is, sort of what are the tools that I can do this in my own organization. And that is, I think that is also that's a useful question and a useful approach. It is hard, but it is certainly doable. A couple of things in terms of concrete strategies. So one thing I think as just a baseline is setting a clear goal, because you're going to need to, and by goal, I mean sort of, maybe goal is not the right word, maybe ethos is sort of the right word. Like, so in other words, having some clear idea that you value, call it whatever you want. You value open communication, or the kind of climate, some articulation of the climate that you're trying to build. We want to establish a culture with open communication where innovation can thrive. And the reason that you need to do that is because you're going to have to return back to, as there's sort of a almost like an elastic sort of pushing back against it, you're going to have to remind people of that climate, of that stated goal. So for example, when somebody says, and again, it's mostly about, sort of statements that have an ambiguous interpretation, where it could be one thing, it could be another, it could be racist, maybe it's not, how do we think about intent, all of those. So that's sort of the space where it gets hard. And you're going to have to return back to this question, well, okay, we can respond to this thing that, I'll give you an example in a second. We can respond to this thing that way, but is it going to get us closer to or further from this goal that we just articulated, or this ethos? And so that's why you need to, it really helps to have that articulated. So, and the example I was going to say was, I worked with an organization one time, and I think this is in the videos, I mentioned this, but, there was a subset of people at the organization who were very offended by the use of the word healthy, right? I don't think they were making it up. I think they were, sort of legitimately, this was something that was offensive to them. And they felt like, I don't want to misstate the argument, but I think it was something like, they felt like it was exclusive to a variety of body types. And they felt like when it was used to describe, for example, diet and lifestyle, that it was sort of normative and judgmental in a way that they were uncomfortable with. Now, so from an organization, how do you want to stand? How do you want to respond to that? Right? Like, do you want to tell? You're going to. And most of the time when I ask this question, people are like, "Oh, like, do you want to tell people to not use the word healthy?" Right? Like, you have some subset of your group that is saying this is offensive. So what do you want to do? Now, most people think, okay, healthy, really? Like, and everybody has their line somewhere. And so without some kind of conversation about where, and even within, identity groups, people don't draw the line in the same place. And so there has to be some better way to communicate about this. And again, reorient toward that goal. Okay, so let's say you want to take the line of, if you say intent doesn't matter and it's all about impact. Okay, so now you've set yourself up for, so you are going to have this very long list of things that people can't say, including the word healthy, because people find it offensive. And again, I don't think they are being disingenuous in their claim of being upset about it. So, but how do you want to navigate that space? And so concretely, I would say, so the goal, or again, the goal may not be quite the right word, but I'm going to go with it. The goal is sort of, that's one piece, and then a couple of other things, just in terms of a couple of other suggestions, I would say 3 things that I think people can keep in mind if you're trying to facilitate conversations. And there's a lot behind each of these, but one of them is our inclination is often to get into an argument with people. I mean, even if we're not trying to get into an argument, it's, well, I think this and you think this and Brooke thinks this, but I think this, and and what do you think about this, and et cetera. And so, and I think that one of the ways to do this is to try, if you're trying to facilitate it, you are trying to keep your opinions to yourself to a certain extent, and people, that may come back as counterintuitive, but I'll come back to it in a second. The second, which is related to keeping your opinions to yourself, is and this is, again, if you're trying to facilitate it, it's not that everybody should keep their opinions to themselves all the time, is to resist personalizing it, right? So when we personalize these conversations, Jeff over here said that he doesn't think that race-based college admissions are a good idea. He thinks that it's unfair for blah, blah, blah reason. And, Mary over here thinks something like, no, Mary, what do you think about that? Now you're sort of pitting people against each other. And so there are different strategies to try and even just gently kind of open up space for a different kind of conversation, which put distance in. So for example, why might somebody feel like this is an unfair way to proceed on either side of that issue, right? What could somebody think about that? Or what might somebody else say, right? So just these very simple tools of putting distance in, if you're trying to facilitate, that keep people from picking at each other. And so I think that can, because again, and this gets to the last point, which is, you are not looking for agreement. Like, if you're not, and this is sort of counterintuitive, you're not looking for agreement. You don't even care if people agree. You're not trying to change people's minds. You are trying to get people to live with the disagreement. And the way to do that is to, and this is going to sound deceptively simple, but is to get people to a point, or sort of foster a recognition that on these issues, there can be multiple perspectives that exist on equal moral footing. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. And so there are ways to do that, but that's where you're headed. And because again, you are not going to get everybody to agree. It's not the goal. And would you really want to, even if you could? I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know that that's a good goal. So anyway, so I'll stop, but that's some general suggestions.
Yeah, and those are really helpful, because while they seem simple, they're pretty counterintuitive, at least if I think about how I might have responded in these situations previously. I mean, it tends to be like, I share like a personal story, right? Where I don't put distance between myself and the conversation. We all, I think, tend to share our personal opinions, because that's how we engage in, I think, a lot of times this type of discussion, maybe because we have a strong opinion. And right. I think the last point is a really, really great one. Like, we're not trying to get people to agree. And I think a lot of times as a manager, that's hard, right? Like, you're trying to typically bring a team together, and a lot of a manager's role is centered around consensus building, right? So all the time I'm trying to build consensus, but in these types of conversations, it's not about consensus building. And that's just, it's counterintuitive to, I think, the way managers act in a lot of other settings whenever we're trying to make decisions. So they're simplistic, but very counterintuitive, at least to me.
Yeah, I mean, and just to be clear, like this is not that I am trying to say that, consensus building doesn't matter, or that,
Yeah.
we should never agree on anything, or you should always keep your opinions to yourself. That's not the take home message
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
It's just on these particular issues, for these conversations, on these issues that touch race, identity, fairness, intent, all of these things, there has to be a different approach. So it's not some blanket assertion that everybody should just shut their mouth all the time and be quiet. That's not what I'm saying at all. But that was
Yeah.
also particularly for people trying to facilitate these conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, no, positively. Well, in a minute, I'm gonna open it up for questions from our participants. And participants, if you have questions, please start typing them in, and then I'll be able to prompt them to Alana. But Alana, is there anything else that you would like to share before we move on to the Q&A portion?
I'm trying to think. I think we sort of touched on a lot of stuff. I'll be curious to see where the questions go, and maybe we'll branch off from there.
Okay. Yep. So I can start with one. We've all probably disagreed with a relative or friend. We have different opinions and around some of these topics, but a lot of times when it's, a relative or a friend, there's this social safety net, and I think about it like my mom's always going to love me, right? Irrespective of if we disagree. But do you have when you talk to different corporations or individuals, any advice about how do you develop that safety net between a team who isn't bound by that same connection?
Mm-hmm. Right. So there's a whole different set of, in fact, I actually think that that's a stronger argument for why you need this kind of work. Because when you have, just to take an extreme example, if you take something like the workplace where you're going to have repeated social interactions, right? As opposed to whatever, some person you don't, give a hoot about on Twitter or whatever, like where you have no investment in maintaining that relationship at all. In the context where you do, there is a shared incentive to sort of get this right in a particular way, and to open up the space for communication. So that is actually, so how do you do that? How do you build that? I think it's a process of changing norms and building a certain set of norms that create that space. I think those norms include, they include things like, how do we think about intent? They include things like being charitable in our interpretations of what other people say and do. And so, and I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but when you have an instance where somebody says something that could be driven by, here, I'll just say, and I'll just make it concrete. So an example would be, and again, you can imagine a time where on the one hand, you can imagine a time where these things wouldn't have come up in the workplace, but I think those days are gone. I'm not saying that I'm not nostalgic for them necessarily. It's just an observation. I think I'm just channeling a particular position. I'm not endorsing it. I think that trans women should not be allowed to compete in women's category sports. That's a position that somebody could take. Now, so you have a couple of issues. One, is that an opinion? Or one or two, is it, is that a threat to, or some sort of denial of dignity to the trans community? And there is no agreement on that issue. And so you're going to have to figure out how to navigate that space. And so going back to what you were saying before about how do you create that space when it's not your mother, right? And so there are multiple ways to interpret that. This goes back to the equal moral footing. So there are multiple ways to interpret that position. For example, one could be just pure transphobia, right? Like the person who's saying it or who's making that argument, they think, for whatever reason, they just are like, no. But the recognition is, and this is, again, hard things are hard, but that's sort of, well, there are other reasons that people could come to that conclusion, could come to that position. And the more you sort of talk through and think through a lot of these issues, more often than not, and I'm happy to give other examples, there is. And so then it's a question of, well, if it could be this reason or that reason for why this person is saying the thing, how do I know which one it is? And what do I do? How do I think about their motivation if I can't tell the difference? Like, I don't know which one it is. And so that's where the charitability piece comes in. But this is a long answer to your question, Brooke, but that goes back to these norms and to the goal. You have to circle back to it, or else you're going to, you spiral. And so that it is a helpful thing to be able to return to.
Yeah, that was a great point that I didn't call out before. Like the first thing you have to establish what's your goal or what's the norm or what's your
Right.
ethos, right? And you really can't start working toward, I mean, it's like anything. If you don't have a goal, you
Right.
don't know where you're going, right? And but I'm not sure we often do that when we have these conversations. So
No,
that's
it's hard. Well, and
yeah.
it's hard. Even establishing the ethos is hard. You may not get
Yeah.
everybody on the same page. And so, does leadership step in? What is the role for leadership? I mean, these are all questions that every organization will have to face. Like, sort of, is it top down? What is your messaging? Is it going to be something that comes up? An organization I'm working right now, it's actually come up organically from the employees, because the leadership is not particularly, not entirely supportive of it. So I think that's going to vary a lot across organizations.
Yeah, and that ties into another question. And the question, it stated like, if people don't agree with each other, I agree you have increased diverse perspectives. Is it at the cost of culture though, as people know they disagree with someone else on their team? And I like, oh, this is my ad lib, but like, that's a great question because we work so much, or my team does, on building a culture, right? And we have a set of shared values, and you're always trying to bring people together. And so can you have that, even if you also encourage, I guess, a culture, or you adopt an ethos where diverse perspectives are encouraged, right? And you're not driving towards that agreement.
Yeah. So the answer is, if you're not doing the work to get to the place where you see that that more different perspectives can be, again, I'm using the same language, can be on equal moral footing, then no. The answer to that question is no, you can't. Because then you're going to have, then you've got this sort of moral valence that comes in that you're not going to be able to get over. If you can get to the place where then it really is closer to a disagreement. Well, I see it this way and you see it this way. And there may be some, people can get fiery about it, and that's fine. But you're talking about, it's not you're a bad person or you're a bad person or you're, again, like class, you're a bigot and you're a snowflake or whatever. Like you're on equal moral footing. So if that's where you are, then those differences, yeah, they can be tense, but they don't have to take over in the way that they do when there's a moral valence attached to it.
Yeah. No, that's helpful. Another question, and this I think is tied to something that we're all experiencing in the pandemic. Managing diverse perspectives is hard normally. Do you have any advice about how you approach it when we're in a virtual environment and we lack a lot of the access to social cues and body language, right? I mean, this is like, we see each other on Zoom, but this is the only part of each other that we see.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, at least with students, I mean, half the time they have their cameras off.
Yeah, exactly.
So then you're just talking to a black box. But I think that's definitely hard. I mean, because I've taught, so just to take the class example, the classroom example, and there's a lot of similarity between the work inside and outside of academia. But just to take the class example, I've taught it in person and I've taught it online. And there is definitely sort of all of those social cues and sort of reading body language and seeing people kind of, I'm going to say this thing, and the person over there, are they rolling their eyes at me? Are they scowling? Like, you don't get that as much, especially again, if videos are off. So I think it is harder. I think recognizing that. I also think that there's a different, again, this is going to depend on people's comfort level, but I think that there is a different role that the facilitator, or, if you're the discussion leader or whatever, that you can take in the online setting to sort of smooth that process a little bit. And that is that, don't underestimate the fact that you can channel different arguments. So even if it's not coming from your participants, I mean, I can't tell you how many different arguments that I don't agree with I have channeled in classrooms and in group settings, right? Like, so, here's an argument, and you can say, like, I'm channeling this argument, or you don't have to, it doesn't matter. Like, if you don't care what people think about your political opinions, that's fine too. But you can sort of play that role more actively than you might if you were in person, for the reason that you're saying, Brooke. But it is a limitation. There's no magic here. It is somewhat of a limitation.
Yeah. A couple of questions have come in around this topic, so I'll ask one, but there are a few. So, it's important to feel encouraged to share your opinion, as you mentioned. How do you encourage your team to do so then when there are so many examples of misuse of social media, spreading perhaps false information on social media, and actually employees being fired over sharing their diverse views via social media? So how do you balance, like, how do you balance, I think, building an environment where you share those diverse opinions, but there's perhaps a social media environment where employees are punished for sharing their diverse opinions within some organizations.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the bigger the profile, I mean, this is true. I mean, to a certain extent, it's true for all organizations, but certainly the higher the profile of the organization, the more that's true. I mean, and so if you don't have leadership, and many organizations don't, who are willing to sort of stand up to social media pressure, then you do have to be careful about it. I mean, I'll just speak for myself. I mean, this is not the only reason, but I do very little on social media.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the only reason why. I just am not a fan, but that you do have to be careful, because now you're in a position where you talk about the social cues that are missing when you're in a virtual setting. Now you've lost tone. Now you've got at your disposal, punctuation and emojis. So
yeah.
And that's pretty much what you're limited to. And the incentives on social media are such that, I mean, I'm not saying anything groundbreaking here, but I mean, all of the research suggests that the more sort of extreme and inflammatory you can be on social media, the more attention you're going to get. And so there's this incentive structure. The exact things that are going to get you attention on social media are the same things that are going to get you perhaps in trouble with your employer. So I think people have to be prudent about what they're saying and how you're presenting yourself. And I don't know that there's a clear answer there. I mean, sometimes you just have to be careful. You can't just, say whatever you want, whenever you want, in front of whoever you want. I mean, I think there's a bigger issue about leadership, and this is in higher education as well, about leadership sort of not backing down to social media pressure. And we talk about that in the book, but that's a bigger problem to solve. I mean, can I convince, university leadership to sort of do it? I mean, no, there's like all kinds of things that come into play there that you may have very little control over.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This question is related to a prior question, but I think it's worth kind of reiterating. So, and the question is, what is the role of leadership in building a social safety net or bringing their people together within an organization? And I think for me, it's in contrast to, whenever we talk about building a culture, I mean, everything you read suggests that a culture has to be something that's built from within, right? It's not a top down that, I as leader can't impose a culture. Is that, in your opinion, is the same thing true whenever you're building a safety net, that it's not something that can be imposed? Or do you see it as, when you're a leader, it is your responsibility to impose that safety net?
I don't know. I mean, you could try and impose this stuff, but you can try, so for example, someone else in the chat will probably be able to remember this better than I can, but I know there are a couple of organizations. There's one whose name escapes me again, that has come to mind, where they try and impose these rules, like there's no political conversation allowed in the workplace. Okay, well, good luck with that. There's just no, I mean, we don't even agree about what political is. I mean, how are you going to, that's not going to work. And so that's going to be a challenge. In terms of top down, you really need, for this kind of work, you need buy-in. And so those three reasons that I said at the beginning, like the sort of moral imperative, the eggshells, and sort of innovation, and the diversity exists anyway. Whether it's one of those three reasons or whether you can come up with some other reason, you need buy-in. This is an important thing to do, and it doesn't mean that all of the other axes of identity and diversity that we think about, there's nothing about anything that I'm saying that says that those things don't matter or that they're not important. So that's really not, this is not a stand-in, like forget about all those other things and we're just going to talk about this thing over here. It's not a stand-in for that. And so I do think that there has to be buy-in. I think you could try and do something top down. I mean, in higher education, we hear people talk about, well, should we, enforce, viewpoint diversity in curricula? Okay, no, probably not. Top down solutions tend to create resentment. So that's not helpful.
Yeah. Next question. What suggestions do you have for practicing having difficult conversations? So you gave us some great tips in terms of distancing yourself and not trying to drive to agreement, but how can we get better at having these types of conversations and having at least more comfort? I'm not suggesting I think that suggestion is not that it'd ever be a comfortable conversation, but But as leaders, like how could we practice this?
Yeah.
Is there a way?
I think the easiest way to practice it before you, and possibly sort of, safer or whatever, before you kind of roll something out, is you can set up sort of small informal groups in your organization, and you can center, I mean, a couple of things you can do. So the main strategy with all of this is to bring it back to questions. It's always coming back to questions. It's not challenging. It's not confrontation. It's not debate. It's about bringing it back to questions. And so I can come back to that in a second, but you can do a couple of things concretely. So, I mean, one thing I'll just say, and hopefully this is okay to say, I get nothing from it, but which is the videos that I did. I mean, I did those with the team at CITL here at the U of I. Those are free. I don't get that, nobody pays me for that. But those, I think those are a really good conversation starter. I mean, it was not just, the content was mine, but I worked with great animators on those videos and a great team at CITL here. Those are short, they're very easily digestible. Those are a great starting place for some of these conversations. I think there are also, you could start by, so a couple things. You could pick an article, right? Like, I mean, I could come up with, somebody wants to reach out to me, happy to make some suggestions, but there are articles that you can, you could just read something. It doesn't have to be, a treatise on something. It doesn't have to be 500 pages. It could just be read a short article, and then that makes you think and sort of talk about that. Or the other thing that you can do, depending on, this may be for down the line, is you can ask people kind of, what's going on? What's on your mind? What are you thinking about? And how do you, and what should we talk about? And sometimes people will have things that are on, on the top of their head but again, you have to have the question thing matters a lot, because it is a way of making these, what are really sensitive issues, making them more, it's not that they're abstract, but it's that you're putting in some distance that makes it not confrontational. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, positive. Yeah, no, positive. Those are great tips.
Yeah.
And this is like, it's a bit of a tangential question, but I'm curious, just your insight, when we talk about this, is there a way, we talked about, maybe it's like, maybe you could try it top down, but it seems like it has to be something that's built from the bottom. When we think as leaders, I mean, we do have discretion over hiring policies, right? We can decide who we hire, who we promote, how we assign teams. Is there a way that managers can use, that discretion to start to maybe build a safe environment and to encourage these types of discussions? I guess, what are your opinions in terms of how it's related to maybe human resource management or labor relations?
I guess I would say that's it. Gosh, I've thought about lots of questions. I'm not sure I've thought about that one as much. I guess my initial thoughts would be that this is coming back to it's more about norms. And so, for example, I don't know that I would necessarily say that you should be, well, although I don't know, I was going to say that you should be screening for this as an employer, but you will, if you set this as a norm in your organization, in your company, that, becomes clear that it's sort of integrated into your culture, people who can't live with that are not going to, they're not going to be happy working there anyway. Yeah. Right. So I think I think if you set it as a norm, I think it will, at some level, over some period of time, it will take care of itself. I do think, and again, I want to clarify this point about top down. I don't mean by that there's no role that leadership can play. What I mean is that if you have a scenario where it's only coming from leadership, and you have the rest of the employee, the workforce, that's like, what the hell, we don't want this, like, then you're, I mean, it's, I'm not saying anything earth shattering here, but then you're going to have a problem. And so that's where the buy-in and sort of, what are we trying to build here, and why is this important? And sort of starting there. Yeah.
No, thank you. Another question is, what is your opinion of the emotional intelligence movement in workplaces? And do you think that EI has value in welcoming and exploring diverse perspectives?
So EI, emotional intelligence, is this largely referring to empathy, or is this the question referring to something else?
I think I'm not an expert in emotional intelligence. I think empathy is a part of it. I think it's a broader construct, but I think there's a lot of there's a lot in the popular press right now that suggests that managers should, focus on, like, can you become more emotionally intelligent? And I think it's being empathetic, understanding, you know, and I guess this is being empathetic, but being able to put yourselves in other people's shoes. So
it is a lot of empathy. Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, gosh, of course, empathy is a wonderful thing, but you're always good. Then you're going to run up in this question against this question of, well, who do you want to empathize with? Like which group are you, which side do you want to empathize with? Who deserves your empathy and who gets to decide and who doesn't deserve empathy? And so even if you decide to focus, I mean, yes, of course, emotional intelligence sounds, that's how could you want less of it? It sounds like, I mean, you know, right? Like, yes, more of it, please. But again, once to the extent that that's sort of the whole concept is undergirded by this idea of empathy, you know, and Paul Bloom he's written about some of this. He wrote his book Against Empathy, which is a little bit of a clickbaity title, but he's a psychologist at Yale. And one of the points that he raises is, again, this question of, okay, well, now you've decided that empathy is important, but who on any of these topics, which group do you want to empathize with? Which group is more deserving of your empathy and who gets to decide?
Yeah.
So now you're right back where you started.
Yeah, positively so. That's a
here, right?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
Good question.
I'm just reading through the questions. Another one, and again, it's maybe related a little bit, but to something we discussed before. What guidelines would you suggest to exercise authority to steer the discussion towards the defined discussion goal? So I think the question comes at, like, how do you, so if the first thing that you need to do is set that goal or that ethos, like, and let's say an organization was going to ask you to come in, like, how would they start that discussion, right? That's even a hard discussion to have.
It's totally a hard discussion to have, but again, in an ideal situation, and it would vary, you know, it varies depending on, you know, there are people are at different stages in this, I hate the word journey, but in their journey or whatever in this stuff. You know, are you like, so for example, there's some people who are, I'm just writing myself a note. There are some people who in different organizations who they're like, you know, they see everything that I'm saying as a problem and they're sort of like, oh, for the love of God, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to proceed. Like, I'm not sure what to do. And that's sort of one starting point. And then there are other places where, you know, it may be sort of, I mean, I could even imagine somebody responding to this and saying, you're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist. You've created this whole problem that doesn't even exist. And you're trying to solve something that doesn't exist. So that's a different starting point. That's a very different starting point. So the question of how to start, I would say in an ideal, if I could, you know, paint the landscape as I wanted to, I would think it would start with a conversation about what kind of climate do we want to create, right? Like where do we want, and that's, now you're going to get, if you can get buy-in from the beginning, that would be a starting point. You know, there are obviously different points. Like if you know you already have, like you had some HR problem or you had some team related problem on these types of issues, you know, now that maybe that's your starting point, right? So maybe that's sort of like, well, we need to think about this. But if you're coming in and you're trying to build the culture, then I do think, and I think that a conversation about, okay, well, how do we want to think about intent, right? So how do we want to think about that? Do you want to, you know, okay, well, I think intent shouldn't matter at all. I think it's only impact. Okay, well, what kind of culture is that going to, where's that going to get us? Like, is that going to get us where we want to be? If that's in terms, if we value open communication, if we value these things that we've said that we value, is that going to get us there? And so that would be an entry level sort of starting point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, thank you. And the next question, how do you reconcile having a climate supportive of sharing different perspectives with the decisions that leaders may have to make? So in other words, does the leadership making a decision that clearly supports perspective A undermine the idea of being open to hearing and sharing different perspectives? That's a great question.
It is a really good question. And at the end of the day, when push comes, so there's the sort of climate culture question, and then there's the sort of, okay, but enough about your climate culture. We actually have to make a decision about this thing over here. And it's either going to be this or it's going to be this, and right. So ultimately, this, like, it's very different when a decision has to be made. So these are businesses and decisions have to get made. And so there's the broader cultural sort of climate. What is the space? What does that space look like in terms of how we're navigating it? And then there's sort of, okay, there's an actual decision that has to be made. I don't ever see it as my place to really come in and tell people how to make those decisions. I mean, I'm going to come in and I'm going to leave. You're going to live with the decision. So, you know, but I do think that there are ways of communicating about those decisions when they're made. I think there are better and worse decisions. And I think there are ways of communicating about them to try and, if you're making decisions in a way that is consistent with the sort of values that we've set up, then again, that's the thing that you can refer back to, like, right. So there's an understanding. I think what makes things worse sometimes, and again, this is not coming from a place of preaching, because higher education, we don't do this well either, where we say we're going to do this thing over here and we're pretending like we're not doing it. Like, or we're pretending that the reasons we're doing it are something different. Well, we're going to do this thing over here, and we're going to make this decision because of what, a particular perspective about how we think about what's fair. And you don't think it's fair, but that's just because you don't get it. Okay, well, no, it's actually not because I don't get it. It's because I disagree with you about, what it means for this thing to be fair or whatever. So yes, the decision still has to be made. And it doesn't, you're not going to please everybody all the time, but there is a sort of an honesty and an openness piece about it. And again, to be clear, there are better and worse decisions. So
yeah, no, there are positively better, worse decisions, but I think your point about how you communicate about the decision that was made is critical. I mean, that implies in like around all decisions, right? Even if it's not this type of decision, if you're supporting, project A versus project B, like you have to communicate about why you made that decision, because someone's project didn't get chosen.
That's sort of generally good advice. Yes.
Yeah, it's generally. I mean,
it goes back to your emotional intelligence question about, well, how does this person who put forth project B feel that their project? I mean, it's so right. So these are, a lot of this is universally applicable.
Yeah, positively. Well, we'll take just a couple more questions. So one is, do you think that there are some absolute principles over which to start or base a discussion or debate? Do we need some kind of ethic anchors?
Yeah, I mean, so in any, again, I think I said at the beginning, no one wants a climate where people are just sort of running roughshod over people's feelings, right? Like that's just it's not good for anybody. So there is some baseline that has to be established. I think that things that are off limits, obvious things, like things that are intentionally, that people say with the intent to hurt or harm somebody, anything like, racial epithets, racial slurs, like these are the kinds of things they're off limits all the time. And I'm making this up on the fly. There may be other things on that list as well, but then all of these other, there's a wide range of other types of comments on other types of topics that really have to be open to discussion. And I don't necessarily know that every single organization would land on the same place with, I think there's probably a lot of overlap. If one of your values is open communication and sort of a diversity of perspectives, you're going to have to keep that, that sort of, I'm thinking of the Overton window, like you're going to have to keep it fairly wide. You're going to have to keep your circle of what's acceptable fairly wide. And it's almost certainly going to be wider than some people are comfortable with. Because it's always going to come back to, if you are going to take the approach that it is always that you are only going to keep that circle as wide as the person who has the lowest level of tolerance, now you're back to eggshells and and all the problems that come with it. So given that, if you agree, if you can start with the place, well, that's not where we want to be, that's not helpful, it's not healthy. See, I use that word. Now you're gonna have to figure it out. So the only way is through.
No, great advice. Another question, how do you handle a situation when you find yourself maybe within an organization where your personal brand and or ethos or values don't match that of the company?
You mean, how would I advise somebody? How do I handle it? Or how would I advise somebody?
I think it's maybe how you would advise someone to handle it if they're within an organization. And I think there maybe the idea behind it, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, they find they're within an organization and they're having these discussions and their personal values, don't match with what the company is putting out.
Yeah, I think you have three choices. I think you can stay and be quiet and just grin and bear it. I think you can leave if you have options to leave, or I think you can, take steps to try and change it a little bit, again, this can be just finding other people who share your concerns, if there's, can you start, again, this one organization I'm working with is the group that I'm working with is trying to start and they don't call it an ERG, but basically an employee resource group about open discourse. So that's not going to be an organization-wide, in their case, level change, but they are sort of, it is important to them. They want to have a space for that. So even if they can't change the ethos of the entire organization, can they carve out some space where this is a little bit, where they're changing some norms? So I think those are the options. How you answer those questions is going to depend on all of the specifics of your circumstances.
Yeah, no, great question. And maybe I'll pose one more question and then I'll ask if you have any kind of final thoughts. The question is, how do we approach situations diplomatically when you're the one that's asked all the questions regarding diversity? Example, let's ask X, and that's the way the question stated, what they think about this.
You mean like somebody saying, like, to me, like, what do women think about this? Or you say to your Black employee, like, what do Black people think about this?
Yes, I think that's the intent.
So right. So the answer to that, in part of this ethos, is focusing on individuals. And so if you set as part of your norms that people do not speak for groups, we speak for ourselves. And that changes a lot. It changes, in ways that people may like less or more. But when you see people as individuals and you recognize that there is no group opinion on anything, really, unless you are talking about, I don't know, the Tea Party or something, or, the Democratic Socialists or something, maybe they've oriented themselves around their opinion. But when you're talking about identity groups and things like that, there simply is no group opinion, right? And so asking people to speak for their group, it doesn't mean anything. They can't speak for their group. Because there is no group opinion. And so that comes with a norm. And so you can back away from those kinds of, or speak about, you have the one, the one non-white person is speaking about diversity. No, they can't, they're not, no, that doesn't even, in an idea, in a setting where you've changed the norms so that you're seeing people as individuals, not as avatars of their group, those questions stop making sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great response. Well, it was a lively Q&A session. I just want to give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts before I'll ask Amanda to close us out.
Yeah, I just am very grateful for the chance to come and speak to your group, and I appreciate the time that everyone has given me. I'm thankful for that. I'm very easy to find if anyone has follow-up questions or concerns or whatever. So please feel free to reach out. But other than that, no, I thank you. I'm grateful for the chance to talk to everybody.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you for sharing your expertise and your advice. I mean, I know I found it very informative, and I'm positive our participants did today as well. So thank you.
Yes, Professor Redstone, Associate Dean Elliott, thank you both for your time today. Lots of great insights shared today and lots to digest and reflect on as we walk away. So thank you very much. Thanks also to our participants today for attending this webinar, for bringing great questions to the table. We hope you gained valuable knowledge, and we hope you'll join us for our next webinar on Tuesday, May 4th. Professor Robert Brunner and James Guzka will present on data science's first mile and last mile problems, drivers of success for data-driven decision-making. Thanks again. We look forward to seeing you again soon and wish you a great day.